Here's what I have in this. This is what I'm intending to do. I'm going to talk about the arrival of French photographers and French photographic techniques here in Ireland. The adoption of French style, including faux French style by Irish photographers, and occasionally French titles by Irish photographers. And then photography in France with French themes by Irish photographers. And throughout this, there's a whole subtext of photography and painting. So this is a very well-known picture to anyone who's interested in the history of photography. This picture from the Boulevard du Temple in Paris in 1838, and the man having his shoe shined in the bottom left-hand side because he was stopped and everybody else was moving. He was recorded. This image was created by Louis Daguerre. Louis Daguerre had earlier been involved with a man called Nice for Niepce, and just as a matter of information, the French government intends in 2026 and 2027 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of photography. Uh, so you look out for events, particularly in France, relating to that. So here's the great man himself, Louis Daguerre. He was the creator of the daguerreotype. He showed his work at a joint meeting of the Académie des Beaux-Arts et des Sciences in around January 1839, and in August 1839, very shortly afterwards, the French government presented the daguerreotype to the world as a free gift, available without license, except that because they paid a pension to our friend Daguerre. However, there's always a however in these things. In Britain, Richard Beard had a license for England, Wales, and Berwick-on-Tweed. We don't have time to go into the Berwick-on-Tweed aspect. There was said to have been no license, and I had always learnt this, that in Ireland you could produce daguerreotypes without a license. But my good friend Michael Pritchard, I believe he's on, has drawn my attention to a paper by John Hanafy, which shows that there were, in fact, patents taken up by Beard for both Scotland and Ireland, which had slightly different legal systems even back then, even though they were in a United Kingdom. But these were never enforced. I won't go into the whys and the wherefores, but factually they were not. I strongly suspect there was a lot of issues there. There was a row with a man called Claudet in England, and also there was a lot of other issues about what the patents were actually about. Were they about the Walcott camera, about improvements and all of that? So here is a Beard studio in Regent Street in London. And one of the first people to have been photographed there was an Irish-based author. She was born in England, though. Born in 1768, a woman called Maria Edgeworth wrote a famous book called Castle Rackrent. And I would recommend all of you to seek out her description of being photographed in 1841. Extraordinary description from someone born in 1768 about having her likeness taken and the like. And that was done by Beard. So she had actually travelled from Ireland bypassing Dublin to go to London. But however, around the beginning of the 1840s, this structure appeared on the top of a building called the Rotunda in Dublin. Now, if I can just mention at this point in time, I should have mentioned his name already, a man called Eddie Chandler. Anyone who wants to know about 19th century Irish photography needs to read the late Eddie Chandler's wonderful masterwork on photography in 19th century Ireland. I recall him in the Dublin meeting in the Dublin Camera Club over 40 years ago, and him describing this particular construction here. Interestingly, there's this drawing, there's Eddie's descriptions of it, but there's no photographs of it. And it was said to have been the first studio in the Rotunda in Dublin. Those of you who know Dublin, it is on the junction today, what is today O'Connell Street and Parnell Square, then Sackville Street. And indeed, there was an area around there called Gardener's Mall at one stage. So what evidence is it there that it was used? There was been a speculation over the years that this was Beard, maybe preparing to come into the Irish market as well, that it may have been other French photographers and even a man who came from Central Europe called Professor Leon Gluckman. But however, this advertisement exists from the 23rd of April, 1842, and it refers to Le Chevalier d'Usson du Bray, and about his art of producing daguerreotypes and of the greatest desiderature, wonderful world that's there, and that he could impart colour to them. One of the things about early photography is this, is that a lot of people in the early days saw it as either a substitute or something that was a complement to painting, and painting was done in colour. And therefore, there was a desire from the very beginning to actually add colour to photographs, even though the technology as yet was not there. I mentioned O'Connell Street. This is a portrait of Daniel O'Connell, who was a great Irish patriot, fought for Catholic emancipation and reform of the Act of Union. He was a member of the British Parliament. He held mass meetings in Ireland, which up to a couple of 100,000 people were said to there. So he was a great Irish political leader. And he was occasionally put in jail. And this one was done in Richmond Prison in Dublin, when he was locked up for trying to get reform of the Act of Union. And this is said to have been done by d'Usson du Bray, and he definitely has painted it because his blue cap has run into his face. But I just wanted to find an example. I was looking around for an example of work done by d'Usson du Bray. So this is French photographer doing an Irish patriot. Now we're going to hop over to France. And here we see a man called Paul Delaroche. Paul Delaroche was a great master at the Academy, or the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. When he first saw a daguerreotype in 1839, he declared the painting was dead. He was a teacher and of the painter and photographer Louis Werner, and also of somebody who's extremely important in art, and I'll mention him later on when we come to him. Just to show the style of work that he would have done then, he did a lot of historical work. I was looking around to see had he done anything that might be vaguely connected to Ireland, and I came across this one of Oliver Cromwell looking at the body of King Charles I after his beheading, after they'd stitched his head back in his body, and there's a remorseful looking Cromwell looking at the body of King Charles. However, as if to prove that painting wasn't dead, a man called James Robinson, who is both a photographer and also a supplier of photographic equipment in Dublin, saw this painting by Henry Wallace of the Death of Chatterton, and people paying sixpence a go to go in and see it. And he said, well, I can do better than that. I can do a colorized stereo image. And he produced this and started to sell it, where he was sued by a man acting possibly on behalf of the then owner of the piece, whose name was Augustus Egg, wonderful name. And he was successfully sued. So painting wasn't dead, it was fighting back. So on to the Werners. And it was through them that I came to give this talk, because I had agreed with Ron that I would write something about the Werner family. This is a carte de visite which Ron gave me by Madame Augustine Werner, and it was done at 15 Leinster Street, Dublin. Of course, the format had originated in France with André Adolphe Eugène d'Esterie and his four-lens device, etc. And of course, a carte de visite, despite it becoming a huge phenomenon in Britain, particularly after Jabaz Mayall's pictures of the royal family, it still kept its French name, carte de visite, or visiting card. Interesting here that this one is down to Madame Werner. There's not too many carte de visite that I see from that era which were done by women. There's an interesting apocryphal story, and we love apocryphal stories here in Dublin, which is that Louis was a portrait painter, but he used to talk a lot to his clients. And this meant he wasn't getting through enough paintings to feed the young Werner family. So she bought him a camera, it is alleged, and told him, you can now paint in silence. Here is the carte de visite by Louis Werner, one done by himself. He was originally from Alsace, born in a little town called Bernwiller. In 1824, he was one of the mass exodus of French-speaking people that left Alsace after 1815 and the Battle of Waterloo and the outcome there. He went to Paris, where he studied painting under the aforementioned Paul Delaroche. Here's the back of his carte de visite, Louis Werner. 15 Leinster Street, Dublin. Here's another example, very nice example. Seeing as we're dealing here with a husband and wife, this is either a husband and wife or a brother and sister, etc. But it's very nicely done. And he continued to be a painter, and Augustine was also a photographer. Hard to distinguish who did what. Now, we're going to look at the location of their studio. This is a place called the Kildare Street Club. It's at the end of Kildare Street in Dublin, where the Irish Parliament has its headquarters. Queen Victoria visited it here in 1861, 3 years before the Werners took up their carte de visite business at number 15 Leinster Street, which would have been the second building from the left, there on the left-hand side, or the second building from the Kildare Street Club, either way. That is where they were located. And here is a later picture. Here from, I suspect, between 1910 and 1920. It shows the Kildare Street Club, which is now the home of the Alliance Française. Interesting, there's still a French connection here. That's the French Language Institute here in Dublin. And in fact, in the other part of the building is actually the manuscripts room of the National Library of Ireland, which holds a lot of Werner's work. But over on the left-hand side, you'll see number 15, the building with the 5 windows up at the roof line. And they're actually facing north. Typically, in those days, you would put a studio where there would be no overshadowing by other buildings and where you would have constant light. If you were facing south, you would have variations in the sunlight during the day. You know, much less variations, but much less light. There was a lot of other designs which were done with mirrors and stuff like that, but this certainly follows a pattern of Harrod's era. But by this stage, by the time this photograph was taken, they'd moved to number 39 Grafton Street in Dublin, which any of you that know Dublin would know is one of the main shopping streets in Dublin. And it was directly opposite number 65, where James Robinson had his studio. Unfortunately, I have to inform you that today, number 39 Grafton Street is now a Burger King outlet, and number 65 is a Canada Goose outlet. So no comment necessary on the cultural movements. Here's a carte de visite from number 39 Grafton Street. The style resembles that of Lafayette, which I will show you later. Very stylish, I'd say almost French. This young gentleman here with his leather gloves on. And it is extremely nicely done. And here's the back of this card. One of the things I've learned very quickly about carte de visite. This one is from the collection of Eddie Chandler, the man who wrote the definitive work in 19th century Irish photography. He had a fantastic collection of carte de visite, which are now in the National Library of Ireland. You'll see at the back here, this has been altered to remove 15 Leinster Street with a gold band, and then 39 Grafton Street has been added. And then at the bottom, it says orders to be accompanied by a remittance. So credit control was important even back then. So here is the son of Louis Werner. His name was Alfred, born 1860, died in 1944. He took over the business around the time of the movement in 1886 to Grafton Street. He was a great photographer. He was president of the Photographic Society of Ireland from 1896 to 1898. Just to record that his older brother Louis, who was an ophthalmologist, who merited a mention in James Joyce's great novel about Dublin, Ulysses, and his younger brother, Emile, was a professor of Trinity College in chemistry. So here we had, and would have probably have known, and definitely would have known, John Joly. So a remarkably talented and able family. So we're going to launch in first to his great masterpiece. You're looking here at an image which seems to be extremely high quality, a young woman, Maud Gonne. Just briefly about Maud Gonne, and she's very famous in my country. She's English, but she was an heiress, adopted the cause of Irish independence. But at the time this photograph was taken, she was living in Paris, but the photograph was taken in Dublin. She's backwards and forwards. With Lucien Mivoy, who was a French MP, who was a boulangist, revengist, and an anti-Dreyfusard, which meant he had strong opinions about Alsace, which would have possibly then given her a connection with our friend Alfred Werner, who is the son of a man from Alsace. This picture won the top prize at the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. Just a few more points about Maud before we move on, is that Maud later on married a man called Major John MacBride, who was executed for treason because he took part on the Irish side in the 1916 Rising. But their son, Sean MacBride, was the Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs when Ireland left the British Commonwealth and became a republic. And his son was also the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. So remarkable people, remarkable family. Even more remarkable is the negative plate. This is the negative plate for the image you've just seen. It's 5'4" by 3'2". It still exists in the archive. It is known affectionately by the staff there as Big Maud for obvious reasons. It had come from the Photographic Society of Ireland and is now preserved in the basement. However, you can see a print of it in Lissadell House in Sligo, where it sits in the above the cafeteria in a gallery. Lissadell House is associated with the Irish poet W.B. Yeats, who also fell in love with Maud Gonne. She was his muse, but she always turned him down. But here she is preserved anyway in her very large print. Now, on the right-hand side, we have the camera. This camera here lives up to the title camera. As we know, the word camera comes from the Italian word camera for room. So camera obscura, darkened room, dark room. This camera was 8 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 10 feet long, and had a 50-inch Ross lens, which it took 2 men to focus. And it could actually take plates up to 6 feet high. It no longer exists, unfortunately, although somebody contacted me recently said they knew where bits of it were, but it's definitely not over the Burger King shop. Alfred Werner became very well known because of this extraordinary feat, but he was also an excellent photographer, and he became very well known as a photographer as a judge. I want to thank my dear friend Michael Pritchard here for drawing my attention to this catalogue here for the RPS exhibition of 1898. And there's a reference here to La Paysanne au Travail, the peasant woman working, and it's in French, for which he was charging the princely sum of 3 guineas. So what is this all about? Well, it's all about this. Would you say that's a painting? Well, you'll see in a minute why it's about this. This is a painting by Jean-François Millet, who was a very famous French painter, also happened to be a pupil of Paul Delaroche, who was also the master of Louis Werner. And this was done about 1857. It was controversial at the time in the Paris Salon of that year, in the sense that it showed the lowest of the low, the poorest of the poor. The gleaners were the people who went around lifting up what was left after the harvest. If you want to see an insight into gleaning and what it means, the Belgian photographer and cinematographer Agnes Varda has a lovely film called Les Glaneurs et les Glaneuses, The Gleaners and I, in which he goes through the whole traditional, religious, cultural and legal tradition of gleaning, which actually existed in France right up into the late 20th century. Before we leave this image here, if you just look at the woman on the left, who's said to be the youngest one here, the way that she has her left hand behind her back with some straw in it, either to hold that or for balance. And let's look at this. This is a photograph taken by Alfred Werner, who was the son of a pupil of Paul Delaroche and done in the 1890s, showing people gleaning in northern France. The work that was done by our friend Mia was done around Barbizon, which is south of Paris, between Fontainebleau and Chailly, where there's flat country. And I suspect that this is where Werner took this, although he may also have gone to Normandy. It's in one of the flatter parts of northern France. One of the important things to note here is the woman to the left of the man. She has her hand behind her back, holding straw exactly like the woman in the Millet painting. How I came across this, though, is interesting because there's a connection here to Ron Cousins, and he doesn't know it. Number one, I was looking for more carte de visite by Louis Werner, and I asked Barbara, who I've done a lot of work, and she's an absolutely fantastic person to work with, did you have anything else by Werner? And she produced these boxes of these quarter plate plates, some of them in negatives, some of them positive for Magic Lantern. And I said, no, that's not what I wanted. I wanted to see carte de visite. She said, but look at them. She's very good, Barbara. And I said, okay, look at them. And I started to take them out. I immediately said, cleaners. It immediately struck me what these were. Now, this might have been purely accidental, the connection here, the connection back to Delaroche. But let's look at a little bit more by Millet. This is his famous Angelus painting, a very famous painting. Just to say that Millet was much of an influence on a lot of other painters, including Van Gogh, Degas, and indeed Salvador Dali. In fact, Dali has done a few Angelus works, with some of them which are in the United States. Dali felt that this was, in fact, they were praying over a dead child. And in fact, it has been x-rayed and there's something underneath it. So Mia may have changed the work several times. It was also said that this was about the potato crop, and they were praying for potato crop. But eventually that he painted the steeple and said they were saying the Angelus. For those who are not Catholics, the Angelus is a prayer, which certainly as a child here in Ireland, we had it in school. That is 12 o'clock in the day and 6 o'clock in the evening, the bell would ring in the church and you'd say this prayer. And before we leave this one, note the fork with the 3 prongs on it and also the basket. And here is a photograph by Alfred Werner from the 1890s. Now, this may be posed, possibly is. This woman, it was near a church steeple. She seems to be gleaning. She's our little basket there. One of the things about Werner is Werner certainly would have spoken French because his mother was French, his father was from Alsace. So he would have been able to communicate with the woman. So there is a possibility there, and that this was in fact the case, that he actually asked her to pray. Après Millet, as they would say. Here's a much less well-known painting by Millet, which shows a woman with a rake. And note the group of people there on the bottom left-hand side. And here's a photograph by Werner from the 1890s, and which the people are gathering potatoes on the left-hand side, and the woman has a fork. I put here a note that this is almost like there's a touch of Maud Gonne in that she is statuesque and that she's showing pride in her work. It possibly was posed and he asked her to stick out her bare foot. Note the fork is the same as the one in the Angelus and also the basket. This to me is just an absolutely stunning image. It speaks to me about a lot of things, whereas Maud Gonne was a very wealthy lady and was hugely well dressed. Here's a poor woman working in the fields, but this speaks to me about the dignity of work. So back to the little mystery from the RPS exhibition of 1898. This one is La Paysanne au Travail, the peasant woman working. And I'm putting this down as a candidate. This was in a positive plate when we found it in the collection, and it has a kind of an amber frame on it. And I'm putting this down as possibly the Paysanne au Travail. However, I have to record that the collection included a great many pictures of hay cutting, potatoes, people up close. There was certainly under the French tradition, there was certainly as many and possibly more women working in the fields than there was men. So we're moving on to this picture, which may be familiar, which is the UK Photographic Convention of 1894. Louis Werner's in this. There's actually in the BJP, there's actually a code over everybody's head here. So Trail Taylor and Howard Grum and all the other people all recognize you. But on the far right-hand side, There's a little man poking himself out at the side with a bowler hat, and that is Louis Werner. Now, it's not particularly good in this particular blow up. He looks a bit like his son, Alfred. And there's another photograph taken by Alfred of the same group at the same convention in 1894. It's hard to figure out whether any of these is in fact Louis. There's the two men with the bowler hats in the middle row, in the middle. And there's another man on the right-hand side. But however, what we have here is a photograph by Alfred Werner of his father, possibly in France. I've guessed that it is the father and not the son. They were rather similar because these were in with the 1890s photographs, at which time Louis was in his 60s and Alfred was in his 30s. So I suspect it was the father rather than the son. Interesting here that it's a cloak and dagger picture. Here you have he's wearing a cloak and carrying a dagger. So it may be something from the French theatre, may even be Shakespearean, et tu, Brute, or it may even be from Macbeth. Is this a dagger I see before me, or even a Daguerre I see before me? This man was taught by Paul de la Roche, and it is rumoured that his class at the Academy included a son of Louis Daguerre. We're doing a bit of volte-face here, and we're coming back to Dublin. This is a playful cartoon in Eddie Chandler's book on 19th century photography. And I've been looking at this cartoon for years and years and years and wondering, would I ever be able to use it? Who did this is not known. The people are either called professors or professors in Dublinese, and some of them are called messieurs. And in this, Professor Curry, beside the camera, is taking a photograph of a cross-eyed woman who has a neck brace around her, and the others are sitting around making comments. On the left-hand side, a bearded figure is described here as Monsieur Adolphe, and that's Edgar Adolphe, a French photographer who based himself here in Dublin. On the ground, there are also photographs of various people. Here at the bottom, slightly towards the right with the moustache, is Professor Robinson, and just behind him, a youngest-looking man who's described as Monsieur Lauder, and they all form part of our continuing story. First of all, Edgar Adolphe. Edgar Adolphe had been in Britain. He was French. Put it this way, he had rather a tempestuous personality. I'm not sure, I don't think this is him of himself. It's a carte de visite done by him. But this could easily have been him. He's married at least 3 times, and libel and bigamy seem to be his stock in trade. He went to jail one time in Britain for libel. He was fined because he was fined £20 and he wouldn't pay the £20. But in no time at all, by the time he got into prison, he had moved a studio inside into the prison. Touch of the Godfather or Goodfellas about this fella. Anyway, he came to Dublin. He was French style. He was on 75 Grafton Street. We've heard mentions of Grafton Street before. There were other photographers there. In fact, in Dublin, what was then Sackville Street, Westmoreland Street, and Grafton Street are all connected going via Trinity College, became known as the Photographer's Mile, and certainly Eddie Chandler used that term. So here we saw that Adolphe was both an art photographer and a miniature painter. So that's from Chandler's collection, as is this one. And this is an unusual title here. French style, it was a thing in Dublin at the time. It's called the City of Paris Photo.com. Could almost be a 21st century URL. And this young man here with a beard lounging up against a pillar, looking at the back, as we always do with the carte de visite. And this is believed to be from the 1870s. Note the Westmoreland Street address is what I've said here. Well, 9 Westmoreland Street was actually associated with Edgar Adolphe. So he was adopting this, not only was he adopting his name, but he was identifying with France at that time. So moving on, here's a photographer's family called Lauder. The firm had been around since the 1850s. This is possibly from the 1880s. Edmund was the father. He's not in the picture. He may have taken this. He passed away in 1891, so maybe he was infirm at the time. At the top, there's a youngish looking man with a moustache, and that is James Stack Lauder. And beside him is his mother, Sarah Stack, later Sarah Lauder. And these became the Lafayette family. There's a key theme here. We don't have the time to go through this, but James Stack Lauder identified himself as James Lafayette or Jacques Lafayette, even though he was Irish. And other people who were in the photograph here identified as being the manager of Lafayette, Glasgow branch, and so on. So what happened that caused this? Well, first of all, Lauder had been around for a long time. And again, note here, this carte de visite was on 22 Westmoreland Street. By the way, in Ireland, we say Westmoreland Street. In Britain, people say Westmoreland Street. So it can be either. And they have been well established. They also, here's the back, here's E and J, that's Edmund and James Lauder, 22 Westmoreland Street, facing the ballast office, which was to do with shipping and time in Dublin, a bit like Greenwich. And they served all segments of the market. Here you see a less stylish type of thing here, this woman, but it's a nice carte de visite, and it's Lauder Brothers, Dublin. And here's the one, this child. And this is at 32 Westmoreland Street. I often wonder what this young chap here, he was hardly going to show his CDV around the schoolyard, or was it this taken by his mother so she could show how lovely her child is? Probably the latter. So here we're on to Lafayette. And this is, again, a degree more stylish. This woman dressed in Spanish style with the dress. All of these are from the Eddie Chandler collection of carte de visite. And she's a fan, and she's the hairstyle, etc. But most important is the back, the CDV. It says, artist and photographer Lafayette, late of Paris. Now, I have no evidence. I've never seen any evidence that Lauder Lafayette were ever in Paris, or indeed that James Lauder had worked there. Perhaps he went over to see Destry and his people, some of the people who were doing this. My understanding is that before the carte de visite became popular in Britain and Ireland, that people from Britain and Ireland went to France on their holidays and saw them, and then when they came back, they were asking photographers, could they do the same thing? And after Mr. Mayall, then they became a huge phenomenon. So what happened? The carte de visite shown here shows Princess Alexandra, who's married to Albert Edward, known as Bertie, the eldest son of Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales. They came on a visit to Ireland in April 1885. They didn't get a warm welcome everywhere they went, particularly in Cork, which in the south of Ireland, which not for nothing is known as the Rebel County. However, when she came to Dublin, she was treated better, and she was awarded an honorary degree in music at Trinity College. And that series of photographs of her, and it's probable that Lafayette or Lauder went across to Trinity College, because Westmoreland Street and Trinity College are right beside each other, and took her photograph. It is said that these photographs sold up to 80,000 copies. So, of course, news got back to Windsor, and an invite came in 1887 for the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria for Lafayette to come to Windsor to photograph the Queen. And a royal warrant followed, and then they opened all over London, Nottingham, Leystone, Cornwall, and then the big ones, London, Dublin, Glasgow, Manchester, and Belfast. So huge success for an Irish firm setting itself out as being French, adopting a French style and even French names. The high point was probably the Duchess of Devonshire's ball for the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria in 1897. The theme was historical figures, and Lafayette was the exclusive photographer for the event. I owe this tableau here to Ron Cousins. Thanks, Ron. Here you see people dressed as possibly the Queen of Sheba or Cleopatra, a Cavalier Knight, an Oriental gentleman, Britannia. It is said that up to 160 sessions were done, and that certainly would have taken more than one day. It must have been a ball that went on for a couple of days at least. From Eddie Chandler's book, however, I've always liked this picture here. It shows the Countess of Warwick dressed as Marie Antoinette, photographed for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in London by an Irishman pretending to be Jacques Lafayette. I think there's the whole French allusion here. Now, one of the things, comments I would make at this stage, of course, there was a French influence, of course, in England and in the rest of the United Kingdom as well. But I'm just dealing here with a very specific one that's come through the Irish Channel, as we say. Lafayette continued to be good clients. The royal family continued to be good clients of Lafayette. Here's Alexandria again with a photo for the Newfoundland 3-cent stamp. My understanding is that Downeys were probably the favorite photographer of the royal family, but they certainly liked the work of Lafayette. And they continued on here in Ireland after independence. This is a man called William T. Cosgrave, the first Irish Prime Minister, or President of the Executive Council, as he was known. And this photograph would have been taken by Lafayette in the 1920s to the early 1930s. The firm continued, regional firm continued up into the 1950s. I think they gradually closed down in the United Kingdom. There is a firm operating in Dublin called Lafayette, which claims heritage back, but I'm not aware of any connection between them and the Lauder family. So we'll move on, and we haven't gone backwards. This is another photograph of Deaners, taken either in Italy or in France. I believe it was in France, but whoever, Jeremy Hill, who's the great-grandson of the photographer who took this photograph, is on the call, and he can talk about this. Last year, Jeremy, a man called Anthony Hobbs, who had worked on these photographs for him, asked me to launch a book on Goddard Orpen's photography in a place called Farmley, which is a stately home owned by the Irish state, where we have foreign visitors, such as the Queen of England has stayed there. And I went into the gallery and immediately saw the quality of the photographs, and they asked me would I launch the book, and I immediately said, of course I will. It's remarkable. The previous case, I was drawing a connection back to Paul Delaroche and also with Millet and French painters. In this particular case, Orpen had a particular interest in agrarian themes. He was very much involved. He was a polymath. He had been a lawyer at the English bar. He lived at Bedford Gardens in London, but then he moved back when his wife inherited an estate in Wexford, and then they got involved with farming. But he was also a man who studied and wrote a book called Ireland under the Normans, a major work, and he did a lot of research in France for that, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But this is a picture from the same man that took the other images. So here's some of his photographs of Paris. Just to explain why he was in Paris, he did a tour around Normandy and also around Paris. He was looking at remaining Norman architecture, particularly in old churches in Paris. And while he was there in 1899, President Felix Faure of France died. And Faure had been involved in the whole Dreyfus affair for the short period of his presidency. And this, of course, takes us back to Alsace. An extraordinary picture. This shows the catafalque. He did something which I would have done, which is instead of getting involved with the crowd, he showed the French people, generally fairly well-heeled French people in Paris, looking at their president's funeral catafalque. One nice thing about this particular image is that it shows something that is in my collection. And that is on the far right-hand side at the bottom, there's a photographer standing on a step. Over his shoulder, he has a canvas camera bag. I have an identical one of those containing a camera which was sold by Le Bon Marché, which is the French department store at the Rue de Sèvres. My one dates from 1903. This was in 1899. So it was remarkable to see that. It would take a camera nerd like me to notice a thing like that. So we're back to painting and photography. And this is a painting of the Rue de l'Échaudé by Goddard Orpen in Paris in 1899. I'm told that these were done before a photograph was taken. And there's some debate on that. There's a man on a riding side saddle on a white horse here, and you're going to see him in a photograph in a minute. But this was actually done by Orpen himself, possibly as a study for the photograph. And this one was done by his wife, Adela Orpen. Adela is a remarkable person, or was a remarkable person. She was born in Virginia in the United States, where she survived the American Civil War, was involved when she was about 9 or 10 years old, tending to wounded Union soldiers. I've seen a daguerreotype of her from the 1850s. She was a very good painter, an extraordinary person, and she also survived the Second Civil War, the Irish Civil War, too, as well. So this is her painting of the same scene. And here's the photograph. This is a wonderful photograph. I'm going to show you some photographs by Eugene Atget, famous French photographer, in a minute. But this one here, what really appeals to me about Goddard Orpen is that for a man who wasn't either a professional photographer or nor was it his career, nor his major thing in his life, he could take a very, very good photograph. You have here on the left side, you have the mineral water carriage. You have the people moving down the Rue de la Chaussée. And then you have this strange character standing there looking like Inspector Maigret, although this was 30 years before Georges Simenon's famous Parisian detective appeared in literature. I just think it's a stunning image. I could not believe it when I went into the exhibition last year and they asked me to launch the book immediately when I saw this. It reminds me of the two things. It's a bit like the Flatiron building in New York, but even more so, a building in Montmartre, which used to house a restaurant called Eau de Théâtre, which I used to go to on my many years of going to Paris for the OECD. Here's a photograph of the same scene done by Eugene Atget in the early 1900s. Now, I'm convinced, looking at the photograph and looking at the vignetting here, is that Atget was just experimenting with this, that he was experimenting with a wide-angle lens. He was a very famous photographer, a very highly regarded French photographer. And there's actually a second example here. In fact, there's a third one, which I don't have, but which was taken probably slightly later. Still shows a bit of decline in the area with the posters hanging off the wall, and it shows a truck there. So I'm speculating between 1910 and 1920 for this particular image by Eugene Atget. But vignetting there, top left-hand side, you can see it. I'm not going to make comparisons between the work of Atget and Orpen, but Orpen's compares very, very favorably. And to finish off my last image here, bringing us to Place de la Concorde by Orpen in 1899. And there's the man on the white horse again. So he seems to have appeared out of that painting here, but he's in the Place de la Concorde and he's riding side saddle, as is appeared to be a woman who's on the horse behind. There are no motor cars here. This is really a fin de siècle, end of century image here. One of the things that I really like about this particular image is the stagecoach on the right-hand side. It's really appropriate for a photograph taken in 1899. It is the 19th century appearing out stage right with the coach, just the coachman barely visible. I doubt if that was intentional, but it just is truly makes this wonderful image, which was taken at a fairly low level. If I'd gone on, if I'd had time, I could go on into the French influence in photography in Ireland and indeed in Britain in the 20th century. You talk about the Magnum photographers and Cartier-Bresson and others, but there isn't time to do that. So just by way of a wrap up, here the cultural influences generally in Ireland were often British, particularly among the moneyed classes. There were French people coming in here through the side door, such as Werner and Adolphe and those, and some of those were both painters and photographers. Obviously, France and Britain. I was asked the other day by I did this talk the other day at the Photo Museum, and I was asked by representatives of the French embassy that which was first, Britain or France for photography, and they said both were first. It was how it said it was. We're both involved with Daguerre and Fox Talbot. Photography took off here rapidly because of the French gift. This French gift to the world was a remarkable thing in its style. And then we had the French style, which included the CDV itself. It was adopted here as well as in Britain. And indeed, it even reached royalty. And I call all of this kind of melange together between Britain, France, Ireland, etc., as an artistic entente cordiale, and it definitely had benefits for everyone. So I just finished by showing some of the acknowledgements here of the people who gave me help with this, mentioning Ron, or mentioning British photo history, etc., the Monk's Grange archives, which Jeremy, and then there's a wonderful site which I'd recommend to anyone who hasn't seen it, lafayette.org.uk, which shows that. And of course, there is the Eddie Chandler collection, which is where it all started for me. So thanks for listening.